There are years in a man's life that pass quietly, like water beneath ice. You walk right over them without ever knowing what's moving underneath. I spent more than 7 decades on this earth believing I understood my own story. I knew where I came from, who loved me, what I had built, and how I had survived the harder seasons. I thought I had counted every hand that helped me stand back up when things went wrong. I was wrong about almost all of it. My name is Alistair MacLeod. I am 72 years old. I spent 31 years as the head ground supervisor at the University of St. Andrews, here in Fife, on the eastern coast of Scotland, where the wind comes off the North Sea with a kind of personal intention, as if it has something specific to say to you, and it will not wait for a polite moment to say it. I retired 6 years ago, and I have lived on Hope Street with my wife Moira for more than 4 decades. We have a stone cottage with a garden at the back that never quite does what either of us wants it to do, and a kitchen that smells of tea and wood smoke on cold mornings, which is to say it smells of nearly every morning we have ever spent here together. I am telling you this because what happened last autumn changed the way I understand every single one of those mornings. It changed the way I read my own memory. It changed the way I think about love, about pride, about the particular silence that lives between men who grew up together and then spent 40 years pretending they did not need each other very much. It started on a Thursday evening in late October when I heard a knock at the front door. I was in the sitting room reading. Moira was in the kitchen. The knock was quiet, almost hesitant, not the knock of someone who expects to be welcomed, but the knock of someone who is not entirely certain they have the right to be standing at your door at all. I set down my book and went to answer it, and when I opened the door and saw who was standing there in the rain with 2 worn travel bags at his feet and a weathered leather coat hanging off his shoulders like something he had owned for 30 years without ever thinking to replace it, I felt something move through my chest that I would not have known how to name if you had asked me right then. It was my brother Hamish, 67 years old, hair gone almost entirely white now, pulled back from his forehead the way he had worn it since he was in his 30s. He was thinner than the last time I'd seen him, and his face had the particular look that belongs to men who have spent the better part of their lives outdoors in all kinds of weather. Not old exactly, but shaped by time the way stone is shaped by wind. He was standing very straight, the way he always has, because Hamish MacLeod has never in his life allowed himself to look diminished, even when he was. He said, very simply, that he had sold his house up in the Highlands. He said he needed somewhere to stay for a few nights while paperwork sorted itself out. He said he was sorry for the short notice. I told him not to be ridiculous, and I picked up one of his bags and brought him inside. Hamish had lived in the Highlands for the better part of 30 years. He worked for decades as a railway maintenance engineer, the kind of work that happens mostly at night, mostly in weather no reasonable person would choose to be out in, on stretches of track far from any town, with a crew of 3 or 4 men who communicate largely through nods and the particular shorthand that develops between people who work together in the dark for years without needing to explain themselves. He was good at his work. He was respected. He was the sort of man who always knew what needed doing and went quietly ahead and did it without making any kind of production out of the fact. He had never married. He had always said, with a mild and slightly deflecting humor, that the railway was a demanding enough partner. He had friends up in Inverness, people he had known for years, a local pub where he had his chair and his regular order and his corner of the conversation. He had, by every measure I could see from a distance, built a life that suited him. And then, apparently, he had sold the house, packed 2 bags, and come south in the rain. I put him in the guest room. I made tea. We sat at the kitchen table and talked for a while, or rather, I talked, and Hamish listened and answered when he felt moved to, which is how it has always been between us. He is 5 years younger than me, but in certain ways he has always seemed older, or at least less in need of filling silence with words. He said the paperwork after the sale was complicated, and that he had a few meetings to get through before he could think sensibly about what came next. He said he did not want to be any trouble, and he expected to have it all sorted within the week. I told him to stop saying things like that. Moira came in from the kitchen, wiped her hands on her apron, and hugged him in the way she has always hugged him. Warmly, practically, without making a fuss of it. She asked him if he was hungry. He said he had eaten on the train. She looked at him in that particular way of hers that means she has already decided something and the conversation is more or less a formality. And she said she would make a plate anyway, just something small. He ate 2 helpings. Later, after Hamish had gone to bed, I was washing up the last of the cups, and Moira was sitting at the table with her hands wrapped around her own mug, and she said, almost to herself, as if she was thinking aloud rather than telling me anything in particular, she said, "Let's not rush him. He should stay as long as he needs." I agreed. Of course I agreed. He was my brother. I thought it was a kind thing to say. A generous instinct, the sort Moira has always had. I did not think much more about it that night. I went to bed, listened to the rain against the window for a while, and fell asleep. I want to tell you about St. Andrews, because if you have never been here, you might be picturing something that does not quite match the reality, and the reality matters to this story in ways I did not understand until much later. This is not a grand city. It is a small coastal town on the eastern edge of Fife, built mostly of gray stone that catches the light in a particular way on clear mornings, almost golden, which seems unlikely given the color of it. But there it is. There are 3 main streets running roughly parallel, North Street, South Street, and Market Street between them. The cathedral ruins stand at the eastern end of town, enormous and broken and beautiful in the way that very old things often are. The university is among the oldest in the world, and it spreads through the town rather than being contained in any single place, so that old lecture buildings and student accommodation and administrative offices appear between ordinary shops and cafes and residential houses in a way that makes the whole place feel layered, as if several different centuries are quietly coexisting without making too much of a scene about it. I spent 31 years walking those grounds. I knew every corner of them. I knew which walls held damp in winter, and which trees were planted by which rector in which decade, and where the drainage problems lived, and which courtyards turned into wind tunnels in February. I knew the smell of the place in every season, cut grass in summer, wet stone in autumn, coal smoke and salt air in winter. I knew it the way you know a piece of music you have played so many times it lives in your hands rather than your head. Since retiring, I walk those streets for pleasure, which is a different thing entirely. I go along the Scores most mornings, which runs along the cliff top above the North Sea. In autumn, the light comes in low and sideways off the water, and the sky does complicated things with cloud and color that would take a better writer than me to properly describe. I walk down to the East Sands sometimes, or out along the West Sands when the tide is right, where the beach stretches long and flat and wide, and the wind is strong enough to make thinking feel like an effort, and not thinking feel surprisingly easy. That first morning after Hamish arrived, I suggested a walk, and he came without needing much persuasion. We went along the Scores. It was cold and clear, the kind of morning where the sea is very dark and very calm, and the light makes everything look slightly more serious than it usually does. We walked the way we have always walked together, mostly without talking, occasionally saying something and then letting it sit without needing to be developed into a full conversation. Hamish has a way of being companionable without requiring anything from you, which I have always valued more than I ever said. He looked at the water for a long time. I looked at it too. After a while, he said it was a good place to end up. I said I had thought so for a long time. He said he imagined I had. We went to a cafe on South Street for tea afterward. It was warm and slightly too bright inside, the windows starting to steam at the edges from the contrast with the cold air, and we sat at a corner table and drank tea and shared a piece of shortbread, and I asked him, carefully, what his actual plan was, where he was thinking of going next, whether he had somewhere in mind. He was quiet for a moment, not an uncomfortable quiet. With Hamish, silence is rarely uncomfortable, just a thoughtful one. He said he was considering his options. He said there was no great urgency. He said the Highland house had taken longer to sell than expected, and the proceeds were in a bit of a complicated state, while some older property arrangements from his working years were being formally unwound. He said it would likely take longer than a week, honestly, probably more like a fortnight, and he apologized again. I told him again to stop apologizing. He looked out the window at South Street. The students were moving past in their gowns, which they wear here in a tradition that must seem completely bizarre to anyone encountering it for the first time. Grown adults walking to lectures in academic robes, looking for all the world like they have wandered out of a very old painting. Hamish watched them with mild curiosity and said he had forgotten about that. I said some things you do not notice when they are ordinary. He nodded as if I had said something much more significant than I had intended. That evening, Moira made Cullen's skink. A proper one, smoked haddock and potato and cream, the way our mother used to make it, thick and warming and smelling of something that goes all the way back. I had not had it in years. I had, honestly, forgotten entirely that it was a dish Hamish particularly loved, but Moira had not forgotten. She set it in front of him, and he looked at it for a second in a way I could not quite read. And then he said it was exactly right, thank you, and ate 2 full bowls. After dinner, he offered again to look into hotels. He said he did not want to impose, that a fortnight was longer than he had originally said, and he understood perfectly if it was inconvenient. Moira said, without looking up from clearing the table, that he would do no such thing, and that was the end of the subject. He looked at me. I shrugged in a way that I hoped communicated that when Moira closes a subject, it stays closed and there is no productive avenue of appeal. He stayed. The days settled into a kind of gentle routine. I went out most mornings for my walk, and Hamish came along on the days he was not dealing with phone calls related to the property business, which was apparently more complicated than he had let on, involving some arrangement with a local solicitor that needed to be unraveled very carefully. He was always polite and vague about the details in a way that I respected without fully understanding. I assumed it was the ordinary frustration of selling a Highland property and did not push. We walked the West Sands twice that first week, long early morning walks where the beach was nearly empty, and the only sounds were the wind and our boots on the hard sand and the occasional call of something overhead. We talked about things that did not matter very much, the state of the path along Leda Braes, a bookshop on Church Street that I thought he might like, whether the university had changed much since his last visit years ago. We talked about retired colleagues of mine, about the changes in the town, about a particularly persistent piece of wall in my back garden that had been slowly dismantling itself for 3 years, and that I had not yet committed to doing anything about. We did not talk about the Highlands. We did not talk about his reasons for selling. We did not talk, at any point, about the years between us. There are things that brothers understand without needing to name them. On the 3rd evening, I woke up just past midnight. This is not unusual for me. I am a light sleeper and have been since my mid-50s, and I often come half awake in the small hours without any particular reason for it. The house was quiet. Outside, the wind had picked up, which it does reliably here in autumn, and I could hear it moving around the eaves in the way I have come to find oddly companionable over the years. And then I noticed, underneath the door of our bedroom, a thin line of light, the kitchen light. I assumed Hamish had come down for water, or perhaps could not sleep. He had always been, I remembered from childhood, a somewhat restless sleeper, prone to lying awake in the early hours turning things over. I got up quietly, so as not to wake Moira, and went out into the hall and started toward the kitchen. The door was open an inch or two, enough that I could see the light, and enough that, as I came closer, I could hear voices, quiet, low, the kind of voices people use in the middle of the night when they are aware of the silence around them. Hamish and Moira. I could not make out what was being said at first. I came a step closer, meaning simply to open the door and ask if everything was all right, and whether anyone else wanted tea. And then I heard Moira's voice, very clearly, saying one sentence. He must never feel guilty for what happened all those years ago. I stopped walking. The hallway was dark. The line of light under the kitchen door was very bright by contrast. I could hear my own heartbeat, which is not a thing I generally notice, and I could hear the wind outside, and I could hear the low murmur of their voices continuing, but no longer any specific words, because something had shifted in my hearing, the way it does when a single thing you have understood suddenly becomes uncertain, and everything around it goes slightly out of focus. I stood there for what might have been 30 seconds, or might have been 3 minutes. Then I went back to bed. I did not sleep again for a very long time. I lay in the dark listening to the wind and turning that sentence over and over, the way you turn a stone in your hand to look at all its angles. He must never feel guilty for what happened all those years ago. The words were plain. The meaning was not. What had happened? What all those years ago? What had Hamish done, or not done, or been part of, that Moira was reassuring him about in the kitchen at midnight, while I slept upstairs not knowing a thing? I thought about the life I knew my brother had led. A straightforward life. It had always seemed to me, hard work, modest living, the railways, the Highlands. Quiet. I had never had cause to question any part of it. But standing in that hallway, I had felt something shift. Not dramatically, not like a door thrown open, more like a photograph moved very slightly, so that a shadow falls differently across a face you thought you knew. I told myself I had probably misheard, that it was the middle of the night and conversations sound different in the dark, and the words had a context I did not have. I told myself there was a straightforward explanation. I told myself that. The next morning, Moira made breakfast as usual. Hamish came downstairs, said good morning, sat at the table with his tea. Nothing in either of their faces suggested anything. Moira mentioned that the baker on Market Street had started doing proper morning rolls again, which she knew I would be pleased about. Hamish said he might walk down later and have a look at the bookshop I had mentioned. Everything was entirely ordinary, and I sat there with my tea, looking at my brother's face across the table, and I understood for the first time in my life that there are things about the people you love most that you have never thought to look for, things hidden not out of malice, not out of deception, but out of a particular kind of tenderness, the kind that does not want to be seen doing what it is doing. I did not say anything about what I had heard, but something had changed in the quality of my attention. I found myself noticing things I had not noticed before. Small things, things that did not add up to anything on their own, but that I was no longer quite willing to dismiss. And those small things, in the days that followed, were about to begin telling me a story I had been living inside of for more than 30 years, without ever knowing it was a story at all. There is a particular quality to the light in St. Andrews in early November that I have never been able to adequately describe to anyone who has not seen it themselves. It comes in low and oblique off the North Sea, and it falls across the gray stone of the old buildings at an angle that makes everything look simultaneously ancient and very close, as if the distance between now and 500 years ago has been compressed into something you could almost reach out and touch. I've lived here long enough that I no longer think about it consciously most of the time. It is simply the light, the way the cold is simply the cold, and the wind is simply the wind. But that morning, the morning after I had stood in the dark hallway and heard what I had heard, I noticed the light, the way I had not noticed it in years. I sat at the kitchen table after breakfast with my second cup of tea, and I watched it come through the window and fall across the wooden surface of the table, and I thought, without entirely meaning to think it, that there is an enormous difference between seeing something every day and actually looking at it, between knowing a thing is there and paying attention to what it is. I had spent 72 years looking at my own life. I was no longer certain I had ever properly paid attention to it. Hamish had gone upstairs to make phone calls. Moira was moving quietly around the kitchen behind me, doing the sort of small domestic tasks she has done in this room for 40 years, wiping down the surfaces, reorganizing things that were already organized, the kitchen equivalent of thinking. I watched the light on the table. I did not say anything. Neither did she. This was not unusual. Moira and I have always been comfortable in silence with each other, which is something I count among the greatest gifts of our marriage. There are couples who cannot tolerate a quiet room, who fill every gap with noise because silence feels like absence. Moira and I have always known that silence between two people who understand each other is not absence. It is a form of presence that does not require constant proof of itself. But that morning, the silence had a different quality. Or perhaps I was simply listening to it differently. I was aware, in a way I had not been 24 hours earlier, that there were things in this kitchen, in this house, in this marriage, in the longer story of my life, that I did not know. And not knowing them felt suddenly like a very different thing than it had felt before. I thought about Moira's face the previous evening. I replayed it the way you replay something when you suspect you missed what it was actually showing you the first time. She had been perfectly ordinary. She had been warm and practical, and herself, as she always is. There had been nothing evasive in her manner, nothing that read as guilt or concealment. Whatever she and Hamish had spoken about in the kitchen at midnight, she was carrying it this morning with the ease of someone who is not carrying a burden, but simply holding something that belongs to them, which told me one of two things. Either what I had heard was genuinely less significant than the hour and the darkness had made it seem, or Moira had been holding this particular thing for long enough that the weight of it had become simply ordinary. I did not know which of those was true, but I knew, sitting there with my cooling tea, that I was going to find out. I want to be honest with you about something, because I think honesty is what makes a story worth telling. What I am about to describe, the next several days, the things I noticed and the things I began to put together, I did not experience as a clear investigation with a clear direction. It was not like that. It was more like the way your eyes adjust to a room after the lights have been dimmed. Everything is the same room. Everything is where it always was. But the quality of what you can see has changed, and things that were invisible a moment ago begin to resolve out of the dark. That afternoon, I walked down to the bookshop on Church Street. Hamish had said he might go, and I thought I would go separately, partly because I genuinely wanted to browse, and partly because I was not yet sure how to be in a room with him while carrying what I was carrying. The shop is a small place, the kind that has been in the same spot so long it has become part of the town's texture, rather than merely a business in it. Shelves from floor to ceiling, a particular smell of old paper and dust and something like wood smoke, a narrow staircase to a second floor where the real treasures live if you know to look. I was upstairs when I heard him come in. I heard the bell above the door, and then his voice saying hello to the man behind the counter, and I stayed where I was among the shelves and listened without meaning to eavesdrop, but also, if I am being fully honest, not immediately announcing myself either. The man at the counter asked him if he was visiting. Hamish said he was staying with family for a while. The man asked if he was from the area originally, and Hamish said no. Well, yes and no. As it happened, he had grown up in Fife but left a long time ago. The man said St. Andrews had a way of pulling people back. Hamish said he was beginning to understand that. I came down the stairs and he looked up, and neither of us made anything of it, the way brothers do. We browsed for half an hour. He found a book about Scottish railway history from the early 20th century that made him smile in the private way he has when something pleases him, but he does not want to make a performance of it. I bought a collection of essays about coastal landscape and light. We walked back up South Street together in the thin afternoon cold and talked about the book he had found and did not talk about anything else. If you are enjoying this story, if it is making you feel something about the lives of ordinary men and the things they carry in silence, I would ask you to do something simple for me. Leave a comment below and tell me where you are watching from. It costs you nothing, and it means a great deal to know that these words are reaching someone. And if you have not yet subscribed to this channel, please do. There are more stories like this one waiting for you. Stories about real people and real lives, and the extraordinary things that hide inside ordinary days. Because that is what this story is about. At its core, underneath everything. The extraordinary things that hide inside ordinary days. The following morning, I had arranged to meet a retired colleague for a walk, Gordon Findlay, 70 years old, who had been the university's head librarian for the last 18 years of his career, and who I had known since the mid-1980s. We met at the end of the Scores, near where it opens out toward the cathedral, and walked east along the clifftop with the sea very gray and restless below us, and the sky doing something dramatic with clouds and occasional reluctant light. Gordon is a precise and thoughtful man who notices things, which is probably what made him a good librarian. He asked about Hamish. I had mentioned the visit in passing, and I said it was going well, that it was good to have him here, that the situation with the property sale was complicated, but sorting itself out. Gordon nodded and said that property in the Highlands was always complicated. He said he had a cousin who had spent the better part of 2 years untangling something similar up near Aviemore. Then he said, in the offhand way of someone who is simply making conversation rather than pointing at anything in particular, that he had seen Moira in town the previous week, before Hamish had arrived. He said she had been coming out of the solicitor's office on North Street. Old Duncan Carver's practice, he thought, the one that had been there since before either of them could remember. He said she had seemed perfectly well, perfectly cheerful. They had exchanged a few words and gone on their separate ways. I said yes, right, and walked on, but I filed it away, because Moira had not mentioned going to a solicitor. Not that she was obliged to mention every errand, of course. That is not the kind of marriage we have. We do not account for every hour to each other. But a solicitor is not the baker or the post office. It is a specific kind of errand that tends to have a specific kind of reason, and combined with everything else, the late-night conversation, the particular warmth of her welcome to Hamish, the Cullen skink prepared from a recipe she had not made in years, it added a specific gravity to that afternoon's offhand remark that I suspected Gordon himself was entirely unaware of. That evening was quiet. Hamish helped me with some logs for the fire, carrying them in from the back garden with the particular competence of a man who has done physical outdoor work all his life, and does it now without thinking, without making it look like effort. We stacked them by the hearth, and he straightened up and looked at the sitting room with an expression I could not entirely read, something between familiarity and something else, something older than familiarity. He said it was a good room. I said we had always thought so. He said he remembered coming here years ago. This was before the guest room became properly furnished, when he would sleep on the old settee and wake up to Moira's cooking and the light through these same windows. He said it had felt like a proper home even then. He said that had mattered more than he probably ever let on at the time. I looked at him. He was looking at the fire. His face in the firelight was very much the face I had known all my life, and also, somehow, a face I felt I was seeing from a slightly different angle than before. The same stone, a different light. I said I was glad he had felt that way. He nodded. Then he said he was going to turn in early if I did not mind. He said the solicitor calls were early the next morning and he wanted a clear head. After he had gone upstairs, I sat by the fire for a long time. Moira came and sat across from me, and we had our evening tea and watched the fire do what fires do, and did not speak for a long time. I thought about what he had said, about this being a proper home, about it having mattered more than he had let on. Those are words a person says when they are describing somewhere they needed, not just appreciated, needed. And I thought, why would a man who lived in the Highlands for 30 years, a man who had his work and his colleagues and his regular chair at his local pub, why would a man like that need this particular sitting room so deeply that he would still remember the feeling of it 40 years later? I did not say any of this to Moira. I was not ready to say it yet, partly because I did not know what I was building toward, and partly because there was something careful and deliberate about the way both of them were behaving that made me feel, instinctively, that this was not a thing to be rushed. Whatever was here, it would reveal itself in its own time. The pushing of it would only make it retreat. So I watched, and I listened, and I noticed. The next day I went down to the library, not the university library, the public one on South Street, a quieter and more ordinary place, the kind that belongs to the town rather than to the institution. I went ostensibly to return a book that had been sitting on my nightstand for 3 weeks, but also because I wanted to sit somewhere quiet and think without the particular atmosphere of my own house, which had begun to feel, in a way I found difficult to articulate, like a room where something was about to happen. I sat at one of the reading tables with a newspaper I was not really reading. A few other people were in there. A couple of retired men I vaguely recognized. A woman I did not know reading something with a yellow cover, the ordinary mid-morning population of a small public library. Outside on South Street, the town was going about its business. Inside, it was warm and still. I thought about my brother. I thought about the years between us, not the geography of them. I knew the geography. I knew he had been in the Highlands while we were in St. Andrews. I knew we had seen each other at intervals that had grown gradually longer, as the years had stacked up and ordinary life had accumulated its own weight. I thought about the texture of those years, the specific character of what had passed between us and what had not. Hamish had always been the quieter of the two of us, quieter and, in some ways I had never properly examined, more watchful. He had a quality, I had always attributed it to his engineering mind, the part of him that assessed structures and identified weaknesses, and worked out where the load was being distributed, and whether it was being distributed safely. He had a quality of paying attention to what things actually needed, rather than what they appeared to need, a practical kind of attentiveness that I had always quietly admired and never particularly said so. I thought about the early years of our marriage. Moira and I had married in the late 1970s, when I was still in the lower grades of the university grounds department, and the pay reflected that fact with an honesty that was almost insulting. We had bought the cottage on Hope Street in a state that the estate agent had described as requiring some attention, which is the polite Scottish way of saying that several things were actively falling apart, and several more were considering it. We had been happy, genuinely happy, in a way that happiness in one's late 20s has a particular texture to it, urgent and specific and lit from inside, as if the scarcity of what you have makes it burn brighter rather than dimmer. But there had been a period of about 3 or 4 years, in the early 80s, when things had been genuinely difficult. The university had restructured, and for a period I had been on reduced hours, which is the kind of thing that is technically still employment, but in practical terms means you are watching your savings, such as they are, make a slow and dignified exit. The cottage had needed roof work. There had been a winter, I recall, when the heating was unreliable, and we wore coats inside and laughed about it with the slightly hysterical cheerfulness that is the only dignified response to genuine hardship. And then, at intervals, not regular exactly, but recurring, there had been what I can only describe as a reprieve, an envelope through the letterbox, a bank draft from a firm of solicitors in Dundee. The first time it arrived, I assumed it was some kind of administrative error. The second time, I assumed it was a delayed settlement from some insurance matter I had half forgotten. By the third time, I knew it was neither of those things. I made inquiries. I went to the solicitor's office in Dundee, a reasonable train journey in those days, though not a comfortable one in January. The solicitor, a small tidy man whose name I have long since lost, said only that the arrangement was confidential, and that the instruction was for the funds to continue arriving at intervals for as long as the arrangement held. He would not say who had established it. He said only that it was entirely legitimate, and that whoever had set it up had been clear that they did not wish to be identified. I came home and told Moira. She cried, very briefly, and then dried her eyes and said that whoever it was, they had very good timing. We never found out. The drafts continued for several years and then stopped. and by the time they stopped, things had improved sufficiently that we did not need them in the same way, and life went on, and it became one of those things that is part of your story without ever being fully explained, a kindness from an unknown direction that you are grateful for without knowing who to thank. I had thought about it occasionally over the years, in the idle way you think about unresolved things. I had had theories. A distant relative of Moira's who had done well. An anonymous gesture from someone at the university who had noticed our situation. I had never fixed on any one explanation. I had, eventually, simply accepted it as one of the mysteries of a life that is long enough to accumulate a few. Sitting in the library on South Street that morning, with the November light falling through the tall windows and a newspaper open in front of me that I had not read a single word of, I found myself thinking about those bank drafts for the first time in a very long time. And I found myself wondering, with a quality of wondering that was entirely new, that had a weight to it it had never previously had, whether the timing of their first arrival had had anything to do with a young man who worked night shifts on remote sections of railway track in the Scottish Highlands, and never seemed to have quite enough money for decent work boots. I did not go home directly after the library. I walked instead, which is what I do when my mind needs to work through something that is too large and too uncertain to sit still with. I went along Lade Braes, the old mill path that follows the Kinnisburn westward through the town, where the trees in autumn make a kind of tunnel of color, and the sound of the water running beside the path is constant and reliable, and has nothing to do with any human difficulty whatsoever. It is one of my favorite places in St. Andrews, and I have noticed that I tend to go there when I need to think about something that matters. I walked slowly. I passed the places I have passed hundreds of times. The old stone bridges. The points where the trees part and you can see across toward the fields and the gray sky beyond. The spots where in spring there are wildflowers along the bank, and in November there is a different kind of beauty, barer, more honest, the bones of the landscape showing through in a way that is quietly compelling if you are in the right kind of mood for it. I thought about my brother building a working life in the Highlands. I thought about overnight shifts on cold railway lines. I thought about the particular economics of a man who works hard and lives modestly, and never quite seems to have anything to show for it. And I thought about how that particular set of facts had never quite struck me as strange before, because Hamish had always been modest, because he had always been the sort who did not accumulate things, who lived plainly, who said when I pressed him that he had everything he needed and I had no reason to doubt him. What if the reason he had never had anything to show for it was because he had been quietly, consistently, sending it somewhere else? I stopped on one of the small stone bridges and stood looking down at the water for a while. The burn ran clear and cold over smooth stones. I thought about the sentence I had heard through the kitchen door. He must never feel guilty for what happened all those years ago. I turned it again. I had spent 36 hours assuming it referred to something Hamish had done that required forgiveness. But what if I had been reading it incorrectly? What if the guilt? What if what Moira was talking about in the kitchen at midnight while I slept was not the guilt of someone who had done something wrong? What if it was the guilt of someone who had done something entirely right and then spent 30 years carrying the weight of never being able to say so? I did not solve it on that bridge. I did not arrive at a conclusion. I turned back toward home as the afternoon began to close in, the sky going that particular deep gray that precedes November dark in Fife, the air sharpening with the promise of cold. But I arrived home with something I had not had when I left. Not an answer, not yet. Something smaller than an answer, and more fragile, more provisional, like the first faint outline of a shape seen through frosted glass. That evening at dinner, Hamish said, very casually, that he thought he had found a man in town who could look at the old stone garden wall. He said he had noticed it on his first day, and it seemed to him that it wanted attention before winter properly set in. He said he had some experience with dry stone technique from his years in the Highlands, fences and walls and the occasional outbuilding, and that he would be glad to take a look at it himself if I would not mind the company. I said, of course not. I said I had been meaning to get to it for months. He said he knew. He said he had noticed. There was nothing in the way he said it that was pointed or meaningful. It was simply a thing he had observed and was offering to help with, the way a practical man does. But I looked at him across the table, at his hands around his bowl of soup, large, capable hands that had worked on cold machinery for 4 decades, that knew how to fix things that were coming apart. And something moved in my chest that I did not entirely have a name for yet. Outside the window, the November dark had arrived fully now, and the garden wall stood in the blackness beyond the glass, and I thought about stones and time, and the things that hold without being seen to hold, and the things that come apart so slowly you do not notice until someone arrives with the knowledge to fix them. And somewhere in the house, behind the ordinary sounds of an evening, the clink of cutlery, the low murmur of the radio from the sitting room, the particular creak of the third stair when Moira went up to fetch something, somewhere in those sounds, I had begun to suspect, the answer to a question I had not known I was asking for 30 years was waiting to be found. But finding it was going to require me to do something that does not come easily to a man of 72 who has always believed he understood his own story. It was going to require me to look at everything I thought I knew from the beginning and be willing to see it differently. There is a thing that happens to a man when he begins to look at his own past with new eyes. It is not comfortable. It is not the warm, nostalgic revisiting of good memories that people sometimes describe, that gentle backward glance at the years that softens everything into something manageable and pleasant. It is something harder than that. It is the experience of walking through rooms you have lived in for decades and realizing, for the first time, that you never turned on all the lights. I did not sleep well that second week, not badly enough to alarm Moira, who knows my sleeping patterns with the accuracy that comes from sharing a bed with someone for 43 years, and would have noticed anything significantly wrong. But I would wake in the early hours, 2, 2:30, sometimes 3, and lie in the dark with my eyes open and think. Not anxiously, or not only anxiously, more with the particular focused quality of a man who has been given a puzzle he did not ask for and cannot set aside. I thought about the bank drafts. I thought about them in a way I had not allowed myself to think about them in 30 years, which is to say I thought about them seriously, with the full weight of my attention, rather than the occasional idle wondering I had permitted myself in the intervening decades. I thought about the timeline of them. The first had arrived in the winter of 1982, which I know precisely because that was the winter the roof began to fail in earnest, and we had a bucket in the upstairs hallway for 6 weeks, and I had been lying awake then too, though for entirely different reasons. The last had arrived, if my memory was correct, sometime around 1988, 6 years approximately, irregular intervals but consistent enough to be deliberate, enough, cumulatively, to have made an enormous difference to the specific arithmetic of our survival during those years. 6 years. I thought about what a man would have to do, over 6 years, to produce that kind of money in addition to what he needed for his own living. There were not many options for a railway maintenance engineer in the Highlands. The basic wage was not generous. The overtime, however, the overnight shifts, the weekend work, the emergency call-outs in weather that reasonable people stayed indoors through, that could add up. If a man was disciplined enough, if a man was determined enough, if a man was willing to work himself considerably harder than his contracted hours for a very long time, without showing anything for it in his own life. I thought about the work boots. This is a small thing, and I am aware it sounds like a small thing, but bear with me because the small things are what finally broke me open on this. I remembered. It had been sitting in my memory unremarked upon for years, the way small details do when they have no context to give them significance. I remembered visiting Hamish in the Highlands in the mid-'80s. A weekend visit, Moira and I taking the train up. I remembered his cottage, modest, which I had expected, tidy, which I had also expected because Hamish has always been tidy in the particular way of men who live alone and maintain order as a form of self-respect. I remembered his kitchen and the view from his back window toward the hills, and I remembered his work boots standing by the back door. I remembered them because they had been in a state that even then had struck me as beyond what most men would tolerate. The leather cracked at the toe, the sole beginning to separate on one side, the kind of boots that are several months past the point at which a man with any reasonable income would simply replace them. I had said something about it, I recalled. I had said something like, "Those boots have seen better days, Hamish," in the offhand way of an older brother who has noticed something without attaching any importance to it. He had shrugged and said they still did the job. I had thought nothing more of it. I lay in the dark in our bedroom on Hope Street, and I thought about those boots, and I thought about the bank draft that had arrived 4 months earlier that winter, and I thought about a man who was choosing, month after month, between his own decent footwear and an anonymous envelope to a solicitor in Dundee, and I felt something move through me that was larger and older, and considerably more painful than anything I had expected to feel when my brother arrived at my door with 2 worn bags and a weathered coat. I got up quietly. I did not go toward the kitchen. I went to the sitting room and sat in my chair by the dark fireplace and looked at the room in the thin gray light that came through the curtains from the street lamp outside. And I thought about what it means to love someone in a way that asks nothing back, not demonstratively, not visibly, in a way that arranges itself specifically so that the person being loved cannot even see it happening. I had always thought of myself as the one who had looked after things. I was the older brother. It is a role that organizes itself around you when you are the firstborn. You carry it without examining it, the way you carry any assumption that has been part of you since before you were old enough to question it. I had always thought of Hamish as the one who was, in some important sense, in my care, not in any patronizing or explicit way, simply in the quiet structural assumption of the older sibling. You are here first, you clear a path, you make the road slightly easier for the one coming behind. It had never once occurred to me that it might have been the other way around. The following morning I waited until Hamish had gone out. He was meeting the solicitor again. There was still some document that needed witnessing. And then I did something I had not planned to do. I went upstairs to the guest room. I want to be clear about this. I was not searching through my brother's belongings. I am not that kind of man, and this is not that kind of story. I went in to open the window, which sticks and needs a particular technique involving both hands and a certain angle of wrist that Hamish would not know, and there is a correlation between closed windows and damp in that room that I have been monitoring for several winters. That was a genuine and practical reason to be in there. But while I was there, I noticed, on the desk that sits beneath the window, that Hamish had left some papers from his solicitor meetings, and the top sheet was face up, and I could see from where I was standing, without touching anything, without looking for anything, I could see the name of the firm printed at the top of the page. It was not a Highlands firm. It was a Dundee firm, old and established, the kind of firm that had been in the same building, doing the same careful quiet work for 60 or 70 years. And it was, unless Dundee has significantly fewer solicitors' firms than I have always imagined, very probably the same Dundee firm that had sent us those envelopes in the 1980s. I opened the window. I stood there for a moment with the cold November air coming in off the North Sea, and I looked at the back garden below, at the wall, the failing stone wall that Hamish had said he wanted to help repair. And I understood something with a clarity that was almost physical, that landed in my chest rather than in my head. He had come back to fix things, not just the wall, not just whatever legal business had followed the sale of his Highland house. He had come back, with his 2 worn bags and his weathered coat, because Moira had asked him to, because Moira had found something out, and had understood something, and had wanted the 2 of us to be in the same place for long enough that whatever needed to happen between us could happen. And she was doing what Moira has always done with the things that matter most. She was not forcing it. She was not managing it. She was simply creating the conditions and trusting the people involved to find their own way through. I closed the window. I went back downstairs. I put the kettle on. If you are still with me, And I hope you are, because we are only now arriving at the part where everything begins to show its true shape. I want to ask you something simple. If this story is reaching you, if you are feeling something of what I felt sitting in that kitchen waiting for the kettle, please leave a comment and tell me about it. Tell me about someone in your life who loved you quietly, from a distance, in a way you only understood later. Because I believe, from everything I have seen in 72 years, that almost everyone has someone like that in their story. They are simply waiting for the right moment to recognize them. And if you have not yet subscribed to this channel, do it now. These are the stories that deserve to be heard, and your subscription helps make sure more people can find them. The kettle boiled. I made tea. Hamish came back an hour later with a slightly wind-chapped face and the expression of a man who has been dealing with paperwork for longer than any person should reasonably be expected to deal with paperwork. And I handed him a cup without being asked, and he sat down at the kitchen table and wrapped his hands around it and exhaled slowly, the way you exhale when you have been holding yourself together through something effortful and can finally let it go a fraction. I sat across from him. We drank our tea. The kitchen was warm. Outside, the wind had picked up again along Hope Street, moving through the bare branches of the rowan tree at the end of the garden with that particular low sound that means winter is arriving in earnest. I said, very carefully, the way you approach something you know is fragile, without yet knowing exactly where its fragile points are, I said. I was thinking about the early years. Mine and Moira's, I mean. The difficult spell we went through in the 80s. He looked at me. His face did not change exactly, but something shifted in it, a very small shift, like the adjustment a man makes when he realizes a conversation has turned in a direction he had not fully anticipated yet. Was it much of a difficult spell? He said. Not a question, quite. More of a considered response to a thing that might mean several things. I said it had been tighter than I had let on to most people. That we had managed. That we had been helped, actually, at a certain point, by something anonymous and unexpected, and that I had never found out where it came from. He looked at his tea. I said nothing more. I let the silence have the room, which is something I have learned over 72 years, that silence, given sufficient space and the right company, will eventually say the thing that words are too clumsy to manage. After a long moment, he said, I'm glad you managed. And that was all. He said he was going to take a look at the wall before the light went entirely. He got up, rinsed his cup, put on his coat, and went out into the garden. I watched him through the kitchen window. He stood at the wall for a long time, running his hands along the stones the way a man does when he is reading a structure through his palms, assessing where the weakness is and what it will take to make it sound again. I watched him for a long time. There is something I need to tell you about the days that followed, because this is where the story becomes something I could not have predicted when it began. I had expected, now that I was fairly certain I understood the broad shape of what had happened, to feel a single, clear emotion. Gratitude, perhaps, or a rearranging sadness for all the years of not knowing, or even a kind of retroactive bewilderment. How did I not see this? How did it not occur to me? How did I let this man work himself to the bone on cold railway lines for 6 years without noticing what it cost him? What I felt instead was more complicated than any of those things. It was more like what happens when you are looking at a photograph you have looked at hundreds of times, and someone points out a detail in the background that reframes the entire image. The photograph has not changed. Every element of it is exactly as it always was. But you cannot unsee the detail once it has been pointed out, and from that moment you are not looking at the same photograph anymore. I began to go back through things, not in a methodical way. I am not a methodical man by nature, despite 31 years in a role that rewarded methodical thinking, in the looser, more associative way that memory actually works when you stop trying to direct it and simply let it move. I would be walking along the scores in the morning and something would rise up. A holiday we had taken in the late 80s, a birthday occasion, a specific winter evening, and I would look at it again with this new light falling across it and see it differently. The holidays. I thought about the holidays. There were several occasions over those years when Hamish had come to join us for a few days. A week in the Borders once, a long weekend on Orkney that Moira still talks about, a couple of Christmases here in St. Andrews when he had driven down from the Highlands. I remembered, now that I was paying attention in a way I had not paid before, that he had consistently found reasons to leave early. Always polite, always with a plausible explanation, a shift he had been asked to cover, a maintenance issue on a stretch of line that needed his specific experience, something that needed sorting at the house. I had always accepted these explanations with the mild disappointment of someone who wishes a visit could be longer, but does not question it. I thought about the timing of those early departures. I thought about the fact that overtime shifts, by definition, happen outside contracted hours, at nights, at weekends, over holidays. I thought about a man who kept leaving family gatherings early, not because he was indifferent to them, but because he had committed his extra hours to something else, because the only time available for the additional shifts was the time that was nominally his own. He had given us his holidays. Year after year, he had given us his holidays. I went down to a retired colleague of mine that afternoon, Ewan McKay, who had worked alongside me in the grounds department for 20 years before he retired, and who now lives near the cathedral in a narrow stone house that smells powerfully of pipe tobacco and old books. I went ostensibly to return something I had borrowed, a garden tool, it does not matter, but really because Ewan is the kind of person whose company helps me think, and I needed to think, and I needed to be around someone who had no connection to what I was trying to think through. We sat in his front room with tea, and Ewan talked, as he tends to, about several things at once. The state of the university's approach to grounds maintenance, which he has opinions about. A piece he had read about coastal erosion along this part of Fife, which concerned him. A small dispute with a neighbor about a hedge that had been festering for several months. I listened and responded appropriately, and let the ordinary rhythm of a normal conversation settle something in me that had been wound too tight. Then, because Ewan is perceptive in the way of people who have spent a long time being professionally attentive to things, he said, "You've got something on your mind, Alistair. You don't have to tell me what it is, but you've got something." I said I was thinking about something someone had done for me a long time ago that I had not properly understood at the time. He nodded. He refilled my tea without asking whether I wanted more. He said, after a moment, "The things people do for us that we do not understand at the time are often the most important ones. The understood ones are fine, but the ununderstood ones, those are the ones that hold up the whole structure." I thought about that for the rest of the afternoon. The hold up the whole structure. It struck me, walking home along South Street in the early November dark, with the shop fronts lit, and the wind coming through the narrow closes between the old buildings with its usual lack of manners, that this was precisely it, not the gestures we see and can name and thank someone for in the moment, the ones that work underneath, the ones we have been living on without knowing it, like foundations we have never seen, but that have been bearing our weight all along. That evening after dinner, Hamish spread some papers on the sitting room table, sketches, rough measurements, notes in his precise small handwriting, related to the wall. He explained what he thought needed doing, running his finger along the sketch the way engineers do when they are explaining a structure, methodically and without unnecessary decoration. He said the main issue was the section on the north side, where the mortar had degraded and several of the key-bearing stones had shifted. He said it was not as bad as it looked. He said with the right approach and a decent few days of dry weather, it could be made completely sound. He said it was the kind of wall that had been built to last a very long time by someone who knew what they were doing, and that the repairs, done properly, would add another generation to its life. I looked at his sketches, then I looked at his hands, then I looked at his face, bent over the table in the lamplight, concentrating, and I felt something that I want to try to describe properly, because it is not a simple feeling, and it deserves more than a simple description. I felt the particular grief of realizing that someone has been loving you faithfully and extensively for your entire adult life, and you have been accepting that love without knowing enough about it to be properly grateful, not ingratitude. I do not think I am an ungrateful man. But there is a difference between gratitude for what you can see and gratitude for what has been holding you up from below, invisible, for 30 years. The second kind lands differently. It lands deeper, and it takes longer to find its way through you. I said his sketches were thorough. He said the job deserved thoroughness. I said I appreciated him taking the time. He looked up and looked at me for a moment. Directly, the way Hamish does not always look at people, the way that means he is actually seeing you rather than simply looking in your direction. And he said, "I've had time to spare, Alistair. I've had time to spare for a long while." And then he went back to his sketches. I did not push it. I sat in my chair and watched the fire and did not push it. But I was aware of something building between those words and the things I now knew or suspected. Something that was not yet fully formed, but that was accumulating weight and shape in the way that the significant moments of a life accumulate. Quietly and without announcement, until suddenly they have enough weight to change the way you stand. Moira came in with her knitting and sat in her chair, and the three of us were quiet together in that old room, which is the room where most of what has mattered to me has eventually happened one way or another, and I thought about all the ordinary evenings that had been made possible, all the years of tea and fire and the particular warmth of a home that has been lived in long enough to feel like an extension of the people inside it. All of it built on something I had not known to count. In the corner of the room, on the small shelf beneath the window where I keep things without any particular organizing principle, books I have meant to finish, letters I mean to answer, objects that have landed there and stayed. There was an old biscuit tin that had been there so long, I genuinely could not have told you where it came from. Round, green, with a faded tartan pattern on the lid. It had been there for decades. I had opened it perhaps twice in the past 10 years. I did not know why I thought about it just then. I did not know why it registered, why it stepped forward out of the general inventory of that familiar room. But it did, and later, when I thought about the shape of how things reveal themselves, not all at once, not in a dramatic single moment, but gradually, each small thing pointing toward the next, I understood why it had stepped forward when it did. Some things wait until you are ready to look at them. Outside the window, the November dark held the garden. The wall stood at the far end of it, patient as stone is patient, waiting to be made sound again, and inside the sitting room, the lamplight held the three of us in its ordinary warmth, and something was very close now, some truth that had been traveling toward this room for 30 years, making its way slowly along the railway lines and the highland roads and the cold stretches of track in the dark, and it was nearly here, and none of us had said a word about it yet. But tomorrow was coming, and tomorrow had a particular quality to it now, the quality of a morning on which something that has been kept quiet for a very long time is about to, finally and carefully, and with great tenderness, begin to speak. I woke early that next morning, earlier than usual, even for me. The bedroom was still completely dark, and the house was entirely silent, in the way it only is in the very small hours before the world begins its preparations for another day. Moira was sleeping beside me, her breathing steady and even, and I lay still for a while listening to it, and listening to the faint sound of the wind outside, and thinking about nothing in particular, which is to say, thinking about everything at once in that unfocused, generative way that the early morning sometimes allows when your mind is working on something it has not yet brought to full conscious resolution. I got up quietly. I put on my dressing gown and went downstairs. I did not put the kettle on immediately, which is unusual for me. The kettle is generally my first act of any morning, as reliable and instinctive as breathing. Instead, I went to the sitting room. I sat in my chair in the dark for a moment, and then I reached over to the small shelf beneath the window, and I picked up the old biscuit tin with the faded tartan lid. I held it for a moment without opening it. It was lighter than I expected, which meant there was not much inside, but there was clearly something because I could feel a faint shift of weight when I tilted it. I set it on my knee. I took off the lid. Inside, as my eyes adjusted to the dimness, I could make out a small collection of things. A few old photographs, face down in a stack. Some folded papers, the kind that have been folded and unfolded many times and have gone soft along the creases. A postcard, a stub of pencil. The ordinary archaeology of a life's small accumulations, the kind of things that end up in tins, because they matter just enough to be kept, but not quite enough to be properly filed. I took the photographs first, turned them over. The light was not sufficient for me to see them clearly, so I got up and turned on the small lamp on the side table and sat back down and looked. The first photograph I did not immediately recognize. Two men on a stretch of railway line, both in work clothes, both squinting against what looked like strong, low sunlight. Then I looked more carefully at the man on the right, and something shifted in me because it was Hamish. Younger, much younger, early 30s perhaps, lean and straight-backed with his hair dark and his expression having the particular concentration of a man who is competent at his work and knows it. I had not seen this photograph before. I did not know where it had come from or how it had ended up in this tin. The second photograph was of all four of us, Moira and me, Hamish, and our mother, who passed in 2003. A summer occasion of some kind. All of us outside somewhere with glasses in our hands and the relaxed posture of people who are genuinely comfortable in each other's company. I remembered the occasion vaguely. The early 90s, perhaps. I looked at Hamish in this one. He was laughing at something off to the left of the frame, fully and openly laughing, the way he rarely did in his adult life, and it struck me that this was the face of a man who was, in that moment, entirely happy, entirely free of whatever he was normally carrying. I set the photographs on the arm of the chair and took out the folded papers. The first was a letter. My handwriting. I recognized it immediately. A particular combination of slant and pressure that has not changed much since my 40s. I opened it carefully, the soft crease giving way without resistance, and read the first line. It was dated February 1983. It was addressed to Hamish at his Highland address. It was a letter I had written in the middle of the difficult years, and I had no memory of writing it, which tells you something about how many things a man does in the difficult years that he later cannot account for. I read it. It was not a long letter. It was the letter of a man who was trying to maintain the dignity of not asking for help while also communicating, to the only person he had felt he could communicate it to, that things were genuinely hard. I had told Hamish about the roof, about the reduced hours, about the arithmetic that was not working no matter how many times I tried to arrange it differently. I had not asked for anything. I had said only that I was managing, that Moira was remarkable, that we would get through it. But the letter, read now from a distance of more than 40 years, was clearly the letter of a man who was frightened and too proud to say so, and who needed to tell someone the truth about his situation, even if he could not bring himself to ask for what that truth might require of the person hearing it. I had sent this letter to my brother, and 6 months later, the first bank draft had arrived from a solicitor in Dundee. I sat very still for a long time. Then I refolded the letter along its soft creases and set it on top of the photographs and picked up the next folded paper. It was not a letter. It was a sheet of figures. Columns of numbers in Hamish's precise, small handwriting. The kind of accounting that a careful man does for himself when he is managing a budget that requires careful management. Income in one column, essential outgoings in the second. And in a third column, headed simply with a word I had to hold the paper closer to the lamp to read clearly. The word was Alastair, a series of figures that represented the amounts sent, with dates beside them, running from the winter of 1982 to the spring of 1988. 6 years, 23 separate transfers. The amounts varied, some months more, some months less, depending on what the overtime had yielded. But the intention was unmistakable in its consistency and its duration. This was not an impulse or a single generous gesture. This was a plan, sustained, deliberate, organized with the care of an engineer who understood load-bearing and did not undertake a structural commitment without intending to see it through. I put the paper down. I looked at the lamp. I looked at the room around me, my sitting room on Hope Street in St. Andrews, the room that had held 40 years of my life, the room where I had sat through all the seasons and all the changes and all the quiet accumulations of an ordinary, and I had always thought, well understood life. I thought about the word ordinary. I had used it to describe my life many times, to Gordon, to Ewan, to people at the university who asked about my retirement. An ordinary life, a good, ordinary life. And it had seemed true, and still seemed true in most of the ways I had meant it. But what the papers in my lap were telling me was that the ordinary life I had always believed I had built with my own hands had, during its most precarious years, been held up by someone I had not thought to thank, because I had not known there was anything to thank him for. He had read my letter. He had understood what I could not bring myself to ask, and he had not insulted my pride by offering directly. He had found a route around my pride, a careful, engineered route, with a solicitor as the mechanism and anonymity as the load-bearing structure. And he had sent the help in a form I could accept, because I did not know who was giving it. He had known me well enough to help me in a way I did not know I was being helped. I heard a sound from upstairs, footsteps, not Moira's, whose tread I can identify infallibly after 4 decades. These were heavier, the footsteps of a man who has spent his life doing physical work and carries it in his frame even in small domestic movements. Hamish was awake. I heard him move along the landing to the bathroom, heard the quiet sounds of the morning, and then heard him start down the stairs. He appeared in the sitting room doorway in his dressing gown, saw me sitting in the lamplight, and stopped. He looked at the tin on my knee. He looked at the papers on the arm of the chair. He looked at my face. I am not a man who cries easily, which is not a virtue or a character strength. It is simply a fact about how I am made, and I have sometimes wished it were otherwise. But I want to tell you honestly that sitting in that chair in the early morning dark with my brother's handwritten accounting sheet in my lap, and 40 years of unknowing suddenly resolved into knowing, I came closer to it than I have in a very long time. I said, "Sit down, Hamish." He sat down, across from me, in the chair where Moira usually sits, with his hands on his knees and his face very still in the way it goes when he is expecting something significant and bracing himself with the dignity he has always had and has never needed to explain. I held up the sheet of figures. I did not say anything. I just held it up so he could see it. He looked at it for a long moment. Then he looked at me, and he said very quietly, in the voice of a man who has been waiting a long time to be seen doing something, and is not entirely certain he deserves to be seen doing it. He said, "I should have told you. I know I should have told you. But you never would have taken it, Alistair." I said, "No." He said, "And you needed it." I said, "Yes." The fire had gone out during the night and the room was cold, but neither of us moved to do anything about it. We sat in the early morning dark with the lamp between us and the papers on the arm of my chair, and outside the window the first gray beginning of a November dawn, starting somewhere behind the clouds over the North Sea. I asked him how he had managed, for 6 years, how he had managed on what was left after the transfers. He said he had managed fine. I said the work boots told a different story. He looked at me steadily for a moment, and then, to my considerable surprise, he smiled. Not a large smile, a small, compressed one, the kind that acknowledges that you have been caught at something and does not attempt to pretend otherwise. He said he had never been able to justify spending on boots when the ones he had were still doing the job. I said the ones he had were not doing the job. He said they were doing enough of it. And that was, I realized, as complete a summary of how my brother had lived his life for 6 years as any longer explanation could have provided. Doing enough of it, getting through, keeping himself functional while directing everything surplus, every extra hour, every additional shift, every pound above what he needed to remain standing, toward a stone cottage on Hope Street in St. Andrews, where his older brother was lying awake, worrying about a roof and too proud to say what he needed. I want to stop here for just a moment and say something to you directly, because this part of the story asks something of me that does not come easily, and I think you deserve to know that. If any part of what I have told you has stayed with you, if you have thought about someone while listening to this, someone who loved you quietly from a distance in a way you did not fully understand at the time, please leave a comment. Not for me, for them. Write their name, or write what they did, or simply write that they existed. Because the people who love us in ways we cannot see deserve to be spoken of aloud, and sometimes this is the only space where that happens. And please subscribe to this channel if you have not already done so. Every subscription is a hand raise to say these stories matter, and they do matter, more than I can tell you. Moira came downstairs an hour later to find the two of us sitting in the sitting room with the cold fireplace between us and a pot of tea I had eventually made on the table, and the papers still on the arm of my chair. She stood in the doorway for a moment and looked at us both with the expression of a woman who knows exactly what has happened and had been waiting, patiently and carefully, for exactly this morning to arrive. She did not say anything remarkable. She said she would make proper breakfast. She said it was cold in here and someone should light the fire. She went to the kitchen. She had known. She had known for months, since she helped him organize the legal papers from the Highland sale, and she had kept it, had carried it, quietly, the way she carries everything that matters. And she had asked him to stay, not because she needed him there, but because she understood that her husband needed his brother close, before this particular truth could find its way to the surface. She had created the conditions. She had made the Cullen skink. She had said, "Let's not rush him in the dark" of the first evening, and had meant something by it that went considerably deeper than hospitality. 43 years of marriage, and she can still surprise me. I have told her since that this is one of the things I love most about her. She accepted the observation in the practical, slightly deflecting way she accepts most things I say that are too sincere, and told me to stop being sentimental and help her find the good plates. The weeks that followed were unlike any weeks in recent memory. Hamish did not look into hotels. Nobody mentioned hotels again. He stayed, and the three of us found a rhythm, the kind that develops between people who have genuinely lived alongside each other before, and can return to it without the awkwardness of people who are trying too hard. We had breakfast together most mornings. We walked, the three of us sometimes, and sometimes just Hamish and me. We went to the bookshop. We had tea at the cafe on South Street. We went to the early service at the cathedral one Sunday morning and stood in the old stone nave with the November light coming through the high windows, and said nothing to each other for a long time after, which felt like the right response. And we worked on the wall. I want to tell you about the wall, because the wall, in the end, is where the most important part of this story happened, without any words at all. We started on it 10 days after that early morning in the sitting room, once the weather had given us a string of dry, cold days, of the kind that are actually ideal for this kind of work. Cold enough that the stone is stable, dry enough that the mortar cures properly. Hamish had ordered the materials he needed through a supplier in town and collected them in a borrowed wheelbarrow from a neighbor, and he set up his operation with the organized efficiency of a man who knows exactly what he is doing and does not need to announce it. I worked beside him. I'm not an engineer, and my knowledge of dry stone technique is limited, but Hamish explained what needed doing with a patience that I found unexpectedly moving, clearly without condescension, simply because he understood the work and wanted me to understand it too. He showed me how to read the stones, how to find the stable placement for each one, how to identify the bearing stones that carried the weight of those above them and treat them accordingly. He showed me that a good wall is not built by forcing stones into position, but by finding the position each stone has been waiting for. We worked mostly in silence, not awkward silence, the silence of people who are doing something together that does not require commentary. The sounds of the garden in November, the birds, the distant sound of the town, the particular scrape and weight of stone on stone, the occasional wind coming over the rooftops and through the bare branches of the rowan at the garden's edge. My hands, which are not young hands and do not pretend to be, learned the weight of the stones quickly. There is something immediately satisfying about this kind of physical work when you are old enough to have stopped needing to prove anything with it. It simply is what it is. The stone has weight. The wall has a shape it wants to return to. Your job is to listen to both of those things and respond accordingly. I thought, working beside my brother in the cold garden, about the years we had spent on different stretches of the same life, about the divergence that happens between people who love each other when the practical business of surviving in separate places imposes its own distances and priorities and routines, about how it is possible to maintain love across a great distance for a very long time, while also allowing the texture of daily knowledge, the specific, granular, particular knowing of another person's daily experience, to thin until it is something more like the shape of a person than the person themselves. I had known the shape of my brother for 40 years. I had not, it turned out, known anywhere near as much of the person inside it as I had believed. On the fourth day of working on the wall, in the early afternoon when the light was beginning to lengthen and go golden at its edges the way it does in November on a clear day, Hamish set down the stone he was holding and straightened up and stood looking at the section we had completed. It was solid, clean lines, each stone placed with consideration for the ones around it, the structure sound in a way you could see without touching it. He said, without looking at me, just looking at the wall, "I used to think that not telling you was the right thing, that it would have taken something from you to know." I said I understood that. I said I might have felt the same if the positions were reversed. He said, "But I've been carrying it a long time, Alistair. It gets heavy. Not the deed of it, the not saying." I picked up a stone and turned it in my hands, finding the angle of it. I said, "I know you didn't want thanks." He said that was right. He said thanks had never been the point. I asked him what the point had been. He was quiet for a moment. He picked up his own stone. He set it carefully in position and pressed it down to find the stability of it before he answered. And then he said, very simply, in the flat and undecorated way he says the things that matter most, "You're my brother." 3 words, that is all. 3 words in the voice of a 67-year-old man on a cold November afternoon, in the garden of a stone cottage in St. Andrews, standing beside a wall that is slowly, stone by stone, becoming sound again. 3 words that contained inside them 6 years of overnight shifts and worn work boots and anonymous bank drafts and early departures from family holidays and holidays given away entirely, and 30 years of silence about all of it. "You're my brother." I set my stone in place beside his. I pressed it down until it was stable. I did not say anything for a while, and neither did he, and the work continued, and the wall continued to take shape, and the November light continued to do its complicated things across the old stone of the cottage behind us. I said eventually, "You should have told me sooner." He said, "I know." I said, "I'm glad you're here now." He said, "So am I." And that was the conversation. That was the whole of it. 2 old men in a cold garden, building something that had come apart, using the particular shorthand of brothers who have known each other for more than 6 decades and have learned that some things are better placed than spoken. And when I tell you it was enough, when I tell you that those few words, in that particular place, on that particular afternoon, were sufficient to resolve something that had been unresolved for 30 years, I mean it in the way that only a man who has stood in that specific cold and felt that specific weight lifting from somewhere in his chest can fully mean it. The wall took 3 weeks in total. We finished it on a clear afternoon in late November, with the sun going down behind the rooftops, and a hard frost promised for overnight. We stood back and looked at it together. It was not perfect. There are sections where you can see that 2 people of different skill levels contributed, and anyone who knows about walls could find the joins. But it was sound. It would hold. It would stand through the winter, and through the springs and summers after it for a long time. Hamish did not go back to the Highlands. I think we both knew, before he said it explicitly, that the Highland chapter was genuinely over, not abandoned in crisis, but completed in the way that a portion of a well-lived life is completed when the work it contained has been done. He found a flat on North Street in January, a proper place of his own, a 10-minute walk from Hope Street, on the second floor of one of the old stone buildings, where you can see a slice of the sea between the rooftops from the kitchen window, if you stand at exactly the right angle. He has made it entirely his own in the way that practical solitary men do, organized, unfussy, with exactly the things in it that he wants and nothing that he does not. He has his cafe on South Street where he goes most mornings. He has found people in the town, retired engineers, a couple of men from the university who share his interest in railway history, a reading group that meets on Thursday evenings in the back room of the bookshop on Church Street. He has his chair and his corner of the conversation, as he always has had wherever he has landed, because that is who he is, and St. Andrews has recognized it. We walk together most mornings, along the Scores, or down to the East Sands when the tide is right, or sometimes all the way out along the West Sands, where the beach stretches long and pale, and the wind says everything it has to say with great enthusiasm, and no consideration for whether you are ready to hear it. We do not always talk. We do not need to. But when we do talk, we talk differently now than we did before that November, with less of the careful management that decades of distance had installed between us, more of the directness that belongs to people who are no longer protecting each other from things that do not need protecting. On a morning in March, walking back along the Scores with the sea very blue and the sky doing something almost optimistic with light and cloud, Hamish said he thought St. Ouen, Andrews, was a good place to grow old. I said I had thought so for a long time. He said he wished he had come sooner. I said he had come when he was meant to come. He considered this for a moment, looking at the water. Then he said, "Perhaps that was true. I think about what I have learned from all of this. Not abstractly, not in the way of a man composing lessons for other people, but personally, specifically, as a 72-year-old man standing in his own kitchen on a cold morning in St. Andrews looking out at a repaired garden wall and thinking about the actual texture of the life he has lived. I spent most of my life believing I understood what love looked like. I thought it looked like presence, the people who stood beside you, who showed up, who said the words and made the gestures, and were visibly, verifiably there in the moments that mattered. And those things are real. I do not wish to diminish them. Moira's presence across 43 years of my life has been the ground I have stood on, and I know its value precisely because I have never had to imagine its absence. But what Hamish showed me, what he showed me without ever meaning to show me anything, which is the best kind of showing, is that the deepest love does not always stand beside you. Sometimes it stands far enough away that you cannot see it at all. Sometimes it works in the dark, on a cold stretch of railway line at 2 a.m, wearing boots that need replacing, sending its earnings toward a solicitor in Dundee, so that your older brother does not have to know he is being carried. Sometimes love is the thing holding up the floor beneath your feet, while you go about your life not thinking about floors. I look at my brother now, at the window of his flat on North Street, at his coat on the hook by my front door when he comes for dinner, at his hands on a stone wall, or around a cup of tea, or turning the pages of a railway history book in the shop on Church Street. And I see all of it at once. The young man with the cracked work boots, the overnight shifts in the dark, the 23 bank drafts, the holidays quietly given away, the 30 years of carrying a secret, not out of deception, but out of the particular fierce tenderness of a man who loved his brother more than he needed to be seen loving him. I see all of it, and I am grateful for all of it. But most of all, I am grateful for this, for the fact that I know that the wall was repaired while both of us were still here to repair it, that we had the cold garden and the stones and the afternoon light and those 3 plain words, and that they were enough. They were more than enough. If this story meant something to you, if somewhere in these words you recognized someone, felt something, remembered a quiet act of love you perhaps have not thought about in a long time, I would ask you to do 2 simple things. First, leave a comment below. Tell me who in your life has loved you quietly, from a distance, in a way you only understood later. It does not have to be a long story, even a name, even just saying that someone existed who did that for you. That matters, and this is a good place to say it. And second, if you have not already subscribed to this channel, please do it now. There are more stories like this one, stories about ordinary people who did extraordinary things without needing anyone to know, about the weight that love carries when it carries itself in silence, about the moments, like a cold November morning in a sitting room with a biscuit tin on your knee, when the truth of a life finally comes into the light. Every subscription tells me that these stories deserve to keep being told. Thank you for listening. From St. Andrews, from Hope Street, from a man who spent 30 years thinking he understood his own story and has only recently begun to see how wrong he was, thank you. From the bottom of a grateful heart,